very much for that. I just am struck by the volume, 40 in defense.
Yep.
I would say 90% of your work in filing patents in Canada would come from PCT applications from outside of Canada. So the work you're doing is just with Canadians who are starting with a Canadian filing, or they're heading to a PCT filing. Explain a little bit about, and I'm still kind of missing who exactly your customers are and how they're reaching you.
Okay. So from a patent perspective, 85% of our clients are foreign. So it means that 15%. So out of these 85%, I would say that 75% is coming from PCT. So it's really through the WIPO process, so the international process, that they will come in and protect here in Canada.
So when you gave a number of 40, where are they resident? Are they the 40 Canadians, or I'm just trying to understand where you're putting effort into helping them, and you were pleased that you could.
So the problem that we're facing is that when you're looking at the business ecosystem here in Canada, 98% are small, medium enterprises, right? So the people who are successful at finding funding to be able to get to protecting are doing so with the ability of the programs, for example, that's been placed by the federal government. However, we need to also recognize that a lot of people do not have the financial means to protect. And when we start knocking on their door to say, hey, this is really valuable and you should consider it, it is not their top priority. It is not their top priority, right? So, and I think this is where we've had a good conversation here around what we should do, what are the things that should be put in place to be impactful. But at the same time, when you talk to the small business, the startup, they're saying there's a disconnect because I need to pay for research and development. I need to pay for my employees. And you're coming to tell me that IP is something that needs to be addressed, right? So I think from our perspective right now, what we're trying to do is build the bridge between the two, right? Understanding the business journey and also understanding the implication of IP, recognizing that the government is putting funding here to help navigating through these challenges. But it's a difficult thing, right? When you look at the large volume of businesses across Canada that falls within.
Just one last question.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. We looked at it from the outside point of view. I want to look at it from the inside point of view when we talk about national security and one keeping the patent application secret.
Mm-hmm.
Since knowing most of the patent applications are foreign and that most Canadians apply through the US provisional and PCT process,
Mm-hmm.
how can we make sure that the patents that are from national security interests are kept secret, since they are looping out, going through the states and coming back as a PCT public?
That's a good question. So what we look at it in what we can control, right? So what we can control is what is being filed here, right? And what is being filed at CIPO, we are able to intercept and make sure that it supports national security. When it goes out there, we expect for the member states that are involved with NATO that the same application of the secrecy will apply, right? So it's not about the origin of the application itself. It's by looking at the application to see if there's a component that could potentially be of national security. So if it is for us, we would expect that it would be the same issue for the US or Europe, wherever they go, right? However, yes, if it's a Canadian innovation that is found in the US and they find it deemed to be perceived as national security, will it be shared across? Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not.
Thank you very much. So I think on that note, thank you very much,
Thank
Kalani,
you.
for having given us a bit of an overview on this. And I would allow people to have 10 minutes of a coffee break, just 10, because we do want to wrap up the day as well, because we have a chat on why IP is economic and national security next, followed by a conversation with my colleague from Axelis, Jesse, that will give a Quebec perspective on innovation as well. And then finally, Senator Deacon, I see you in the room, so I will have you for a fireside / closing, so we can bring up closing from 5 to 4:45 if possible.
assets and intellectual property, and economic and national security. And you make the argument that sound management of IP and data, in particular, are required for economic security. The work reviews the idea of economic warfare and identifies many areas where Canada's management of intellectual property leaves vulnerabilities and missed opportunities for value creation from IP. And you make 5 major recommendations for policy changes to address this. And you saw them earlier on my slide. So open source intelligence, steps to secure Canadian research, reforming investment controls and actively acquiring technologies that complement Canada's security needs, investing in domestic compute and storage, so the whole data sovereignty conversation, and finally harmonizing trade secret and IP governance legislation under federal jurisdiction. And I have empathy for you since I direct an institute that deals with the challenges of federal asymmetry in this country and intergovernmental relations. And so this is another example of where if you don't have an integrated, a single capital market, this is one of the manifestations of, you also have a fragmented IP and trade security framework. So I'll ask sort of a broad question about the paper, and then we'll sort of try to get a question in on each of the 5 points. So the paper argues that Canada's poor management of IAIP leads to lost value creation and weakened economic security. What's the single most critical change in the global geopolitical landscape that required moving IAIP management from a traditional commercial issue to a fundamental state security concern?
Oh, I really like the phrasing that Raquel Gerber's used in one of her CG papers, where she said United States' jarring approach to resetting its relationships, trade relationships with allies and adversaries alike. That combined with some high-profile cases where it has become very clear that economic dependence on China and some of the supply chain bottlenecks that go through that have caused economic sovereignty to sort of come to center stage across most of the NATO or all of the NATO allies at this point. And so it's been a fairly abrupt shift, I think, in the way that NATO countries are thinking about sovereignty and economic interdependence compared to even a few short years ago, that really lays the groundwork for this whole conversation being critical right now.
And from my perspective, what really what got to me, what the genesis of this paper as well was when you looked at the Foreign Direct Investment Canada Act. If I put my lawyer hat on for a second, there was I had a lot of difficulty being able to define what was exactly of national security when you're looking at it from an invention perspective. We all know that there's a lot of value to intellectual property, to intangible assets, but when you're being acquired, the triggering element of what was considered to be injurious to Canada wasn't quite as clear. From a legislative point, it's a bit vague, but from a scientific / legal thought process, what exactly became of national security concern? Because the Patent Act didn't necessarily go far enough, because it was always about the munitions of war, which was very, very specific. But what happens when you're adopting things from dual-use technologies that have both the civilian and military applications? That's where it got a lot more interesting, and also seeing how these technologies get reviewed by some of the economic agencies as well.
It's a super interesting point, because if we can make the point, so does the term national security even still make sense in the 21st century? Because it sort of assumes that government's going to look after your security. And so this is a great example of like government's not going to look after your security. It can maybe set the framework, but in so much of the security is ultimately vested with the society, with the companies, with the legal professionals, and so forth. So it's a super interesting challenge also to how we understand security in the 21st century, and whether we're adequately postured for the environment. So look, so your analysis highlights that control over Canadian IP and data is frequently lost through entirely legal means. And so I'm hoping that you can sort of elaborate a bit on this, sort of the way legal exfiltration of valuable IP creates issues of security.
So a lot of it has to do with the question of the actual framework that the Patent Act or other acts or treaties around the world, is that the concept of a patent obviously is the exchange of disclosure. in order to get the monopoly or to be able to have the right to exclude others from that using the invention. So right there, you're being put in position to disclose everything in order to get the monopoly. And on the other side, you have the acquisition, the M&A activity. You have, for instance, the UK government just announced last week that there was over $45 billion of foreign money that was being used to just acquire all their technology, but they didn't know who was behind that because they were using shell companies. We didn't necessarily know who were the beneficiaries of those companies and where the technology was ultimately going to get siphoned.
Yeah, so my corner of innovation policy is heavily focused on research and research commercialization and more recently research security, and where a lot of the frameworks that govern how we fund research, especially how we fund industry partnered research, are set up in such a way that IP is often transferred or at least controlled by the industry partner to this research at the conclusion of the research itself. And we get into it a little bit sort of later in the paper when we're talking about NSERC Alliance, but a lot of the partner organizations are Canadian subsidiaries of foreign firms. Now, a lot of those, majority of those are firms controlled by allied countries. And so there it's not so much a security issue as an issue of lost value, where the intellectual property coming out of these research partnerships is often of much greater long-term value than the benefit to Canada accrued just through the research partnership itself. A bunch of high-profile cases of this, for example, there was a Dalhousie Battery Lab, for example, that a few years ago had a partnership with Tesla, where for, I don't know exactly how much, maybe a few $100,000 of research money per year, Tesla got access to this world-class battery IP that was coming out of the lab. And so cases like that represent, to my mind, missed opportunities where the value that Canada is getting in exchange for those research partnerships may not be reflected may not be reflective of the value of the IP that's being transferred out. And so this is where less a security concern, but more just an issue of rethinking and realigning these frameworks to make sure that the value of research IP coming out of Canada's very productive and very world-class research institutions is being properly valued in the context of those relationships.
You both make super interesting points, because it's like I often sort of reinforce we think in terms of an ontology of territory, but of course we live in a globalized world. Our epistemology has to be one of mobility and of transnational movement of IP and how we reconcile these sort of legal frameworks that are necessarily based on territorial jurisdiction with these transnational movements, and the challenge sort of behind that, and how we think through the policy processes in the second and third order consequence. And I mean, your point about, some of you might know that I have a separate life on researching financial and economic crime, and a long-time advocate in this country and elsewhere for beneficial ownership registries, precisely because the opaqueness is such a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to that. I mean, it's not only the question of a M&A transaction type work, but it could even start earlier on when you're looking at collaboration agreements. I mean, the universities are very hungry for investment, and sometimes the only trade-off that they have is part of what's coming out of research labs, and finding out these collaboration agreements that have to be entered into. But often what happens is that the foreign entity might be able to have I'll say the word in French, emprise, a little too much of a hand on that intellectual property, that they're able to capture it just by simply putting the contracting party in default. Like, say, for instance, you don't pay something, well, then you're in default, and therefore you get to acquire that collateral. And it's a very opaque / vague way of a nebulous way to be able to get your hands on Canadian intellectual property, and it happens a lot more often than one would think.
It turns out also,
and even funding agreements. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's also a way that some adversarial actors launder money through
absolutely.
Canada and through universities, something that a lot of people aren't aware of. So the rigorous analysis of the NSERC Alliance Advantage program from 2019 to 2024, and we only evaluated that program. We didn't evaluate the other funding programs. This is just one program, right? So found profound leakage of $700 million. So this is your and my tax dollars spent funding partnered research. 43% supported research with at least one foreign controlled partner. When restricting the focus to projects with commercial potential, so those involving for-profit partners, 52% of funding went to projects with foreign-controlled entities, and critically, 33% of funding went to projects where the only for-profit partners were Canadian subsidiaries of foreign-controlled companies. Hence my point earlier this morning about we need to list private sector actors, adversarial and malign actors that we shouldn't be working with. So at the same time, you argue that the numbers are largely irrelevant. Can you elaborate on those points and in the, Lenin's famous sort of words, what needs to be done?
So there's been a debate for quite a long time around flow of control of IP coming out of public research. This is something that Jim Hinton looked at in the context of AI a while ago. Universities pushed back on the basis that they looked only at, for example, public ownership registration and mislicensing in that discussion. And the debate sort of became one of the degree to which IP was being handed off to foreign companies for commercialization. The comment about the numbers being largely irrelevant is predicated on the idea that when we're talking about research IP and emerging technology, it's only a very small minority of the IP assets that create the vast majority of the economic value in the long run. And so arguing about whether it's 33% or 20% or 10% is missing the point that the important question is, well, which 10% is it? Which 33% is it that is actually leaving? And over which we're losing control. And so one of the things that we advocate for is having federal guidance on governance of IP assets arising from publicly funded research. And one of the key components of what we suggest there is that it's very important that research institutions that receive public money report on long-term access to and control over the IP assets. And further, that be done in such a way that anyone who downstream gains access to that IP must also comply with those reporting requirements. The intention being that we need actionable data to demonstrate where control over the minority of these assets that are actually valuable in the long run is going. And so the 33% number there, I won't hazard a guess as to whether that is too high or too low. Some foreign direct investment in research is almost certainly a good thing. Partnered research is potentially a very good diplomatic tool, but we need to be able to understand, does that represent all of the valuable IP? Does that represent none of the valuable IP? And where is all of that going in the long run? Who has access? And that's something that simply is not captured in public data right now.
So just to echo Kyle's point on this, I think it's a question of, the type of effort that's going to be taken in order to capture the data and the data points or the metrics that we need to be able to capture to be able to understand the efficiency of the programs that are being run. That's one. And we find that most of the way to go about doing this is obviously you're going to look at a top-down policy approach, but there's also the funders, the investors that are putting money into that. One of the only ways that you can really ensure that you have this data, this capture of data, is through the funding agreements, the financing agreements. So there's a certain corporate governance, so to speak. And I'll put air quotes around that because it's not imposed, it's not an obligation, but it'd be a good one to be able to take, to be able to capture proactively that data as well.
Super interesting, because this is, now the Ontario Research Fund, for instance, in funding agreement already gets universities to report on various metrics and the like. So we actually have a very good steering mechanism that already exists that we use to that effect. So be relatively low transaction cost to incorporate that.
So just to add to that, there was recently a StatsCan survey of universities on technology licensing. It was published and then it was almost immediately unpublished after some pushback from the universities. What often happens in in licensing specifically is that there is a non-disclosure agreement in place that governs the interaction between the partner and the university, which is perfectly understandable and standard. But what that means practically is that the license and control over IP gets hidden behind that NDA, and that's where it gets lost to public data collection possibility. And so part of what goes into the sale agreement, for example, is a set of metrics that ensures that that can't happen and that information is collectible and accessible.
So why don't we make that the last question, the sale agreement, since you have this simple agreement for innovation licensing. So how does the sale framework specifically address the problems of long-term foreign control over IP rights without requiring individual universities or government labs to undertake the challenging and lengthy process of drastically changing their internal IP policies? I think it's a fascinating way to frame the problem.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that tech transfer hasn't been standardized to this point in Canada is because without that top-down guidance from funding agencies, every institution has a completely different IP policy. There's a whole spectrum of institution-owned and founder-owned and hybrid models, which makes it very difficult to change anything because often those are baked into the collective agreements. And so when we wrote SAIL, we built it to be adaptable to any existing Canadian IP policy framework of which we're aware. Basically, you can plug it into any Canadian university, and it will be adaptable and flexible enough to work with every institutional policy of which we're aware and enable that tech transfer. SAIL doesn't bake in IP retention in the sense of punishing loss of IP, for the simple reason that universities aren't litigious, generally speaking. And so a provision like that baked into a licensing agreement would be fairly toothless in practice because the universities, for the most part, aren't going to act to enforce that. But what SAIL tries to do is to seed the process of building an ecosystem where IP can stay in Canada, right? These people who are developing these innovative startups based on research IP, scientists who are developing this IP, they're not doing it with the intention of selling the IP. And in a lot of cases, the fact that IP goes abroad is a matter of necessity rather than what the research involved want to happen. And so SAIL tries to lay the groundwork for an ecosystem where it's possible to develop, where that technology can cross the valley of death and get to a place where it can actually be developed. Where the IP retention piece comes in is downstream, and David was talking earlier about the Investment Canada Act and export controls and all of this, where it's important to be able to align those legal frameworks with the research agreements that govern the generation of the tech that leads up to tech transfer.
So the other thing about SAIL as well is it's based on 6 axioms. One of those axioms is everyone's working towards value creation, making sure that all the investment dollars that are being put into the startup stay within the startup in order to create more value, some would say generational wealth, or to be able to build more value within those companies. So there's another 4 axioms that also have to be considered, but it's also giving the visibility to the partners, the parties at the table, to know what are they engaging themselves into, what happens, when there are other investors or follow-on investment that comes into a startup, for instance, to know what they're getting involved with on a multi-year basis, based on a question of milestones, to be able to make sure that you have continued investment coming into the model, and then knowing when it comes time to have the buyout event, or that the company gets acquired, well, making sure that, or sorry, not when the company's getting acquired, but when you're acquiring the full IP rights from the university, when there's an assignment, when there's a transition being done, how that's being discussed early on. That's something that's very important in order for the SAIL initiative or the SAIL framework to work effectively.
On va peut-être clôturer notre conversation pour garder bien l'heure.
S'il vous plaît.
Et donc, je vous recommande fortement de télécharger le papier. Donc, Why IP is National and Economic Security. Donc, j'espère qu'on vous a bien tenté de lire le papier en entier. Et je vous remercie de la conversation et on va passer immédiatement à la prochaine intervenante.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. I'm just going to have to check my agenda now. I believe it is Jesse. There. No, that's not you. Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. Sure. Wait.
Bonjour à tous. J'imagine que quelqu'un va mettre sur ma présentation. Ah, c'est le clicker qui va être prêt. Wow, vous êtes très organisé, merci. Quand même, pour David qui fait tout, il fait même amener le podium. C'est très impressionnant. Ça me fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. J'ai préparé ma présentation en français, mais je sais qu'il y a plusieurs personnes dans la salle qui apprécieraient probablement, même s'ils ne l'avoueraient pas publiquement, que je la fasse en anglais. Donc, je vais me permettre de la faire en anglais avec votre permission, mais la présentation et toute preuve aura été faite en français. Donc, entre nous, toute la présentation était en français. So I will do my presentation in English, even if you see it here in French. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm sharing a few data points. I'm actually selling my punch here, which some of you have seen me speak before, have an idea of where I'm going to go with this. It's a pleasure to be here today. I was in Ottawa last week, amongst other things, for the CSPC conference, Science Policy Conference. There's also the IP Innovation Summit. I know Mike is here somewhere as well, who put that on. Really important to have these venues where we take a step back from our day-to-day realities and share a bit what we're working on, compare best practices, and ideally build a little bit more towards what can be done. And that's what we're doing here today. So kudos on being here, all of those of us who have invested time. But that is not enough, or I should say, and yet that is not enough. So I'll come back to that. A couple pieces, since we're here, a bunch of people interested in IP, and I'm not the only wonk in the room. The innovation paradox, I air quoted it, and I'll come back to that as well. The innovation paradox being that we have a scientific productivity that's actually very strong. We're punching above our weight as a country. So a bunch of stats here. We have 3% of the world's publications versus being versus the OECD average of about 2.5%. But we have a relatively low conversion of that towards PCTs, for example, per $1 million of the translating it here live becomes interesting, of the PIB, of the gross domestic product, is 6 in Canada versus 15 in the rest of the OECD, ou l'OCDE en français. So again, you see these disparities between how much we're able to do and what we're actually ending up doing from an IP, intellectual property, intellectual asset perspective. 3% of the production of scientific world production versus 1% of patents, or as it is defined by PCTs, in the world. 1 patent per 1,000 publication versus 2.5 per 1,000 publications in the United States, and 4 if you look at South Korea. You guys know these stats fairly well, I assume. I'm just reminding us of them. The contribution of industrial R&D, or BIRD, being a very small minority of our overall R&D in Canada versus the government expenditure or the higher ed expenditure. The BIRD is only about 30%. So we have this paradox, air quote. There is good news, and now I'm selling my punch again. Quebec tried a bit of a different model known as, Axelis, the organization I'm here representing. We've put in place a lot of effort and a lot of resources to try to make these bridges more accessible, because it is futile to just say, well, our companies don't spend enough on R&D. There's lots of people out there explaining why they don't spend enough on R&D. There are perfectly reasonable reasons for that. It is futile to just say that our university or our public research does not generate enough IP. There are perfectly logical reasons for that. Again, I'm selling my punch a little bit, but I will give you a glimmer of hope here, which is really important. In the last 4 years, there was a commission, a study commissioned by the Quebec government last summer very similar to StatsCan, which was pulled fairly quickly. I'm going to wink at that. But that did show that we had a 50% increase year over year in the last 4 years of pre-evaluations, the very earliest discussions with our researchers coming out of public research on inventions that they were that they had and that they were willing to discuss to explore whether or not there's potential to go further with them. There was a just over 15% increase year over year again on the declarations of inventions that came out of public research. We didn't discuss declarations of inventions here, but that is obviously the step before even having any IP. And I will state the obvious that even the declarations of inventions are well below what they should be, given the kind of dollars going into the public systems. And finally, that over 50%, around 60% of our inventions are patentable, which is very interesting. There is potential there, but again, well beyond, below that are actually being protected, which may or may not be a good thing, because the point is not to protect everything, but to at least have the discussion and to think about whether or not we should. But to do that, we need to declare it, have a discussion, and then decide what we want to do. And here is part of the why, and why I air quoted the innovation paradox. There's a very good reason for that, and I'm winking at David and Kyle's article last month, saying that it's actually not a paradox. It's very logical given the structure of the system that we live under. And here are just a few of the areas. Canada is very rich, and Quebec, being one of the provinces, rich in many different programs that are innovation intermediaries. However, we're only as rich as or productive as those programs are able to work together. Otherwise, it's used as a divide and conquer, and organizations are just trying to cherry pick which programs give the most money or the most accessible, and not necessarily which program is the best one for this means. So we need to be able to facilitate this as an ecosystem and make sure that these programs are working together with a certain alignment. There's a fragmentation of financing, and that's not a bad thing. It's very logical. There are many different mandates, many different jurisdictions. Just at the provincial level, you have Le Fonds de Recherche de Québec, which funds a lot of the operational costs of higher education. You have the Ministry of Higher Ed, which funds a lot of the fundamentals of the education's ability to be able to teach, to do research. And then you go to the federal level, you have the Tri-Council, which funds a lot of the projects. You have the FCI, who fund a lot of the infrastructure. These are all great mechanisms, but they're only as strong as they're able to coordinate between each other. Otherwise, a lack of alignment becomes the Achilles heel of this very strong web, which is no longer a web. It becomes a bunch of holes in it if it's not well aligned, well orchestrated. A second set of I'd say, constraints or of explanations why you have these stats that I just shared with you are what is actually being incentivized to our researchers. And this isn't me saying it. Axelis created a dedicated last year, 2024, bootcamp of innovation to inviting 100 of Quebec's most high-impact researchers. We invented the term high impact to say researchers who are very involved in translational, in patenting things, in supporting entrepreneurship. And we listened to them. We gave them a stage. And they said, well, what we're really strongly incentivized to do, the pressure on us, is to publish quickly. What your dean wants to hear in your first few years is to publish, is to get good scores on your teaching, because the tête de pipe is how the university is funded for perfectly logical reasons. The number of students you have goes directly with your funding, and your ability to go get Tri-Council funding. Those are three really hard things to do. So the other things become not extracurricular. They're important, but they're not the most important priorities that the researchers are under the gun to do. So no wonder that we're not seeing a ton of the translational piece. These are pieces that a lot of the researchers would say are things that I'm doing because I really care about it, because I happen to have a supervisor who cared about it, who got it, who taught me how to do it, because I was so stubborn I kicked down the doors to make sure that my invention was turned into a startup. We're now hearing these terms becoming more and more socially adopted. However, it is still not necessarily translating into the l'engrenage, that the gears of the system pump this out fluidly, automatically. So again, maybe it's not such a paradox, and it certainly isn't functional to just say, well, you should be doing more. We need to look at how are the incentives, the carrots, facilitating, supporting what we want to see in the output. So the consequence is, well, the data, some of the data points I shared just before. So to sum that piece up, we're very good. There's lots of inventions. We're good inventors. We're good in research. We have very strong research infrastructure. It doesn't always translate into the innovation piece. And that's not just jargon. It's not just semantics. It's applying the fruits of our research, the inventions, towards an actual case, an actual need in society with an added value. To put it in another way, the Global Innovation Index talks about inputs and outputs. We're very strong in the inputs. We're some of the top of the 15th in the world. But in the outputs and productivity, intangible assets, et cetera, we're some of the weakest, and we are trending worse and worse if you look at comparison to other OECD countries. So hugely problematic, especially now when we talk about economic sovereignty. So a quick word about Axelis so that I keep my job. We were put in place with a mandate by the Quebec government to maybe not maximize, but ensure that the fruits of our research are able to find the highest impact possible across domains. So not just tech transfer, but valorization, the French word really applies, valorization of the fruits of our public research. There's two major arms, two major ways that we do this. The first one is we support across all public research the actual projects. When you have an invention, we'll work with the researcher and the research institutions to try to evaluate the potential impact in that invention. Where would the impact be in society, and what would be the trajectory to get it there with a vector of society, usually a company or a nonprofit or a ministry, and how do we get it deployed? We also manage a maturation fund where we can actually finance some of that maturation to get it to a higher TRL so that the company or the adopting organization knows that it can actually do what it thinks it can do, which is a good idea. The second piece is a little bit different. It's not at the individual deal flow level to support researchers and institutions where they want us to support them, but it is at a level of the society to say, where do we stand at the societal level? So some of the data points we're talking about, can we start to measure them cohesively, coherently, all measuring the same kind of data points? David and Kyle were talking about that before. Can we start to compare ourselves, not to shame, but to learn from what is going on better in certain areas or less well in other areas? We've created a number of different frameworks of innovation policy. We're working with a number of different universities who are revising their IP governance policy to help advise them on some of the best practices of different innovation governance, IP governance models that seem to work better or less well. And it's not always the buzzwords or the trends that are those. We look at data points to see which generate the most impact. We've created a whole bunch of tools, including the tools we use in our first mandate, which we've shared with all PSCs and all public research at the cost of sharing our secret sauce to mutualize the tools that we work with so that we can do more and more of this. So this is with the second half, more of a maestro at the societal level of public research, maximizing impact of public research. So if that translates into the mention before of inputs and outputs. In the last few years, we have put a lot of effort into structuring, proactively structuring agreements with different entities in different jurisdictions with different mandates to make sure that there is some alignment and passing the ball between each other. So last week, we announced a memorandum of understanding with NSERC, for example. That wasn't just a handshake. There's a whole bunch of tangible pieces in there where we work with NSERC. We will be working with NSERC to say, well, when NSERC funds something, and it may be fundamental, and the impact may only come 5, 10, 15 years later, we need to follow that impact to be able to bring it back to NSERC and say, hey, that thing you funded in 1980 actually led to a really impactful transfer in 1985 or 95, which allows you to justify your budgets and fundamental research. But if we don't connect those dots, then people say, well, why are we spending all this money to do this? Because there's impact. Let's follow it, measure it, and make sure that those virtuous cycles are created. As one example, NSERC will also work with us to say, hey, after there's an invention, something interesting, a flag goes up, and there's a support brought into the researcher to say, hey, do you want to have an idea of what kind of impact there is potential out of this, and what would be the trajectory? Because that's a different skill set than the skill sets that led to that invention in the first place, as one example. So we have many other examples of partnerships that we've proactively put in place to not leave it at a whim or at hazard whether or not we're going to be able to translate these heavy investments in public research and that they're going to turn into innovations and impact to society, but say, no, we're going to structurally hardwire pieces to make sure that it works and it fits together. So these are other examples of inputs that we've invested in what we have jurisdiction over, what we have control over. And then when we talk about our own offer, we've worked very hard to simplify it, reduce the barrier of entry for the researcher who isn't necessarily motivated by going and get economic gain in the market. That's not what attracted them in the first place. So do we reduce the barrier of entry to getting it onto this track towards ultimate impact in society? Because no researcher doesn't want to see that impact. Those are inputs in terms of what we've put in, outputs. So we've had some interesting realizations. Again, these are immediate outputs, the number of partnerships that the number of public research institutions that we work with, the number of declarations of inventions or softwares that we've helped to support. This is all from last fiscal year, 24-25. The number of dollars that have gone into projects to mature technology that generally go from TRL 2.3 to TRL 4, 5, sometimes 6. So a bunch of cool outputs. Great, but those outputs alone don't mean that much in terms of impact to society. They're intermediary. So if we go one step further, there was an independent report generated by Mallet, an external consulting firm. I'm sorry, I realize the building I'm in, but it just happens to be the firm who did this study. It's in tiny writing, it barely even shows. Showing the actual economic impact in Quebec generated by all these outputs. So now we're going a little bit further. We're going a little bit further than the outputs. We're going towards some outcomes. So over 800 jobs that were created or supported, directly linked to those translational pieces from public research. Over almost $150 million in economic impact directly related to the efforts that were done. And finally, a 4-time multiplier on the public dollar investment into Axelis, and that's the dollars going into Axelis just last year, that were translated into impact on society. Quantifiable, measured, not just saying we know there's good stuff here. That isn't good enough. So now we're talking a little bit more towards outcomes. Further down. And here's the stat that I am most proud of, and it is most important to me, linked to some of what we've talked about. Since April 1, 2025, almost 90% of our transfers coming out of our public research here in Quebec went to Quebec SMEs. Almost 90%. That compares to about a quarter to a third across all domains domestically in Canada. This is possible. But it does cost more money. You can't just go to the highest bidder or the quickest deal at the transactional level. You have to really look beyond that at the impact for the society who has invested in you in the first place. And that's harder. In fact, that's really hard. But even that isn't enough. And I challenge ourselves, I'm selling the next punch. We've created a vice presidency just to measure impact, innovation impact, to be better at quantifying, tracking, and keeping ourselves accountable to the ultimate impact that we're seeking to have, and then also linked to the policies that we think are important and connecting the dots across different things. And the last thing I'll do is loop back to my opening and saying, it's great that we're all here today, but I challenge you, I dare you to do more than just be here and network and sell your own salad, which we all have to do and it's part of the game, but find someone who's got a complementary mandate in an organization who you think could connect to yours somehow, the next piece, the piece before, tangential piece, and think about how you could line up a follow-up meeting to maybe structure, hardwire something between you guys, you folks, so that it's not just haphazard and we say, look, there's all this great stuff, and it should lead to something at the other end. It isn't enough anymore to have the pieces. We have to connect the dots, or this thing will not work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Are there?
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
While the new panel comes on,
Sure.
I believe there's Senator Deacon that had a question. Good luck, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks in advance.
Jesse, great to meet you in 3D.
Yes, likewise.
Your energy is just as good. Either way, I got to tell you. In terms of creating that pull, I'm always struck by the fact that we're not solving our own problems with our own capacity. And if we could get regulations and procurement to work with our innovators early on, you've got something that I think would increase that number even further. Can you just talk about efforts in that regard?
Thank you. I very much appreciate that you used the word pull. Innovation pull is a piece we need to structure into our day-to-day better. There are enough problems and challenges to face that we should start from them and not look for a problem starting from a solution. So yes, innovation pull is a solution. And then procurement, and this goes well beyond our mandate, but is very important. I'll give an example where it can help in Axelis's case. We're working to try to understand, for example, in the healthcare system, what are the priorities of needs in our healthcare systems, and what does it take to get it into the system if you do have an invention. So I can then turn around and tell my teams, hey, if you find an invention that touches one of these 3, 4, 5 priorities, it's worth 5 stars. Put it ahead of the queue, and hey, can we actually have streamlined mechanisms into the public health sector, which is controlled by the government as well, and can we know what it's going to take as a barrier of entry? And then it's my team's job to make sure that we set that up as we're maturing the technology from whatever TRL we're starting from. So there are enormous opportunities to hardwire that, and that keeps it then domestic around our problems. And then the extra, sure, we need to collaborate. There's a role for diplomacy and being connected to the rest of the world. But let's start here because there's lots of needs here. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Really appreciate it. Round of applause for Jesse, please. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce a new panel that we have. It's called Food Defense Securing Canada's Sovereignty from the Ground Up. A very interesting panel because who would have thought of being agriculture or food being so important for our defense? So I would like to introduce to you the moderator, Kathleen Reed. As a principal and founder of Playbook, Kathleen Reed is renowned for her unique ability to foster growth and resilience amongst emerging tech companies and organizations, including several ag tech innovators. Her deep expertise and experience in strategic communications, combined with an impressive entrepreneurial track record and strong industry, government, and media relationships, enable her to build strategic partnerships and drive client growth across the rapidly evolving innovation ecosystem. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, nice. I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, and if I speak French, you will all want to leave the room. So I'm going to do this in English. Thank you, David. Thank you, FORPIQ, and thank you for leading the conversation on how important IP is to our national sovereignty. And a shout out to Kyle and David on your new report. I look forward to reading that on the plane home. So today's topic, food defense, securing Canada's sovereignty from the ground up, is a critical and timely conversation. You may have seen headlines about this. It's something that I think we're all starting to talk about. Agriculture generates 7% of Canada's GDP, and it is critical infrastructure. Yet, it's often missing from national defense strategy. So we're going to dive into that today. That's what we're going to talk about, and we have a fantastic panel. So I'll quickly introduce them, and we do have someone joining on the screen, so hopefully folks can see them. I don't know if we have to advance a slide so that everyone can see John, who's on the screen. Nice. So I'll start with Karn Manhas. He's the founder of Terramera, Miraterra, and Catalera, and they're really leading the charge on soil intelligence, and they have an interesting approach to IP, so hopefully we can dive into that a bit. And then we have Darren Backus, the Executive Vice President of Agri-Food Alliances and FCC Capital, so exciting to talk about some of that capital investment that you can drive. And then on the screen, we have John Ruffalo, who's the founder and managing partner at Maverick Private Equity. So he did have a great Substack post recently on this topic. I'm not sure if folks have had a chance to read that. Super interesting. And a quote really stood out to me as I was reading that piece. And I think that's where we'll start to kick off the panel. So when another country controls the conditions under which you can feed your people, your sovereignty is at risk. So let's start there. And maybe, John, we can start with you. How is food linked to sovereignty and defense?
Oh, thank you, Kathleen, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, so the issue around food is really an issue around sovereignty. If you, and I know the topic today is a lot about defense, and this is no difference. And it's really the foundation of why we formed Mavericks. It was really anticipation of the geopolitical headwinds that we really started to see about 10-ish years ago. And, we had expected that the world was going to move from a globalized state into a regionalized state. And it was going to be triggered by the US reverting back to its pre-World War I policy of isolationism. And frankly, I used to tell folks, go back and dust off your Monroe Doctrine to understand what the world might look like. Now, one of the areas that I didn't anticipate was that I did believe that we were going to develop a regional fortress North America, and Canada would likely tether its wagon to both the United States, and Mexico and Canada would really draft behind the United States. And the question around food sovereignty perhaps may not have been at the top of the issues. But what was going to be clearly evident that in this deglobalization, we were going to witness broken supply chains, the world a much more dangerous place, shipping costs going through the roof, et cetera. And we had fully expected that, again, the issue around food was going to be much more regional, i.e. North American centric. But a couple of things have happened. Number one, back in 2020, the impact of COVID really emphasized for the first time the threat and the physical impact to Canada if the US borders were closed to all the food that we get transported, particularly from Mexico. And then number two is, of course, the whole trade saga. And I think now it's coming to light that food can be weaponized. And here we are, Canada, frankly, the most blessed country in the world with all of our vast natural resources. And yet we're now looking at whether we actually have what it takes to defend our own population in the event of further global breakdown.
Darren, Kern, do you want to comment on that at all?
Sure. So, John,
Batteries might.
We all do a lot of these. So, look, thrilled to be here today. Oh, there we go.
Oh.
And we were joking about this before, just as a starting point. First of all, I'm with Farm Credit Canada. Can anybody nod if they know Farm Credit Canada? 10 years ago, unless you were a farmer, you did not know Farm Credit Canada. 5 years ago, Karn and I, guess what kind of conferences we went to? Food and ag conferences. Guess what happened today? We are at finance conferences. We are at defense conferences. We are at IP conferences. We are at technology conferences. 7% of the Canadian GDP, 1 in 9 jobs. A country that is blessed with ample primary production, fresh water. We should be a global super powerhouse. Did we think this way even 5 years ago? We did not. And you know what? That's okay, because we're Canadian. Humble. We send out by export more than half of the calories we produce. Think about that for a sec. More than half of the calories we produce, we export. So what are we doing today? We are feeding the world. What was the quote that we said? When another country controls the calories, you are in trouble. So guess who is controlling the calories today? We are. Do we think that way? No, we don't. So, I am, and I think we're all thrilled to be here with this audience, to be talking about food and agriculture, but in particular to be talking about the overlay of food security, which again, food security even 5-6 years ago was really talking about food access, food banks. Very important, but not food security. Today, we're talking about food security. We're talking about how can we drive Canada and Canadian food and ag to become even more of that global superpower. We're talking about how to make sure that, let's think of what every human, absent side cases, will do tomorrow. What will everyone do tomorrow? You're going to sleep, you're going to breathe, and you're going to eat. Well, and drink, but fresh water. And wine, distilleries. But look, super happy to be here and just reinforcing what, and John and I have had this conversation multiple times. We were thinking about this a decade ago, not crystal ball, but just thinking about, my goodness, how has it played out? My goodness, never thought we'd be sitting here with you talking about food and ag, even if it is the 3:45 slot in the afternoon. So, Karin?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. So I just want to pick up on a couple of things, John and Darren.
Me like I'm frickin' Frankenstein. Take your med.
Hey, John.
That was my medicine reminder.
Those that don't know John, that's his personality in a nutshell.
Well, welcome audience feedback at any time. Don't just stand there like a Frankenstein. All right. So what John and Darren were saying, I think that this conversation actually is about two things. We talk about food security, and I think people I understand the concept of food sovereignty. Why food and agriculture is important to Canadian sovereignty and our ability to build our economy, grow our economy, and then there's food defense. So I just want to talk about those a little bit separately. Because food security, I think, is our ability to secure our food and agriculture systems, but to also grow it, to grow our economy. And agriculture, Canada is one of the world's leaders in agriculture, as Darren was saying, 7% of the GDP. I actually learned this from FCC. Canola alone, just canola, is a larger industry in Canada than automotive, steel, and aluminum combined. Huge. These are just small parts of the agriculture industry. And, just like small increases in agricultural productivity have huge impacts on Canadian GDP. And, in our ability to build our sovereignty, we are learning now more than ever how important it is for us to be able to grow our economy, to grow our customers for our products. And Canada is, pretty good. I think 6th largest agricultural producer exporter, 5th largest. But can anyone guess who's second? Probably think about the US. US is first, right? Second is the Netherlands. The Netherlands. It's a country that is not too much different in size than Vancouver Island. I mean, you can drive around the whole country in a day.
And they are sinking.
And they're sinking.
Right? Like existential crisis, which is a whole discussion about what motivates human behavior. But like whenever we see that stats at FCC and we're talking about number 2 is the Netherlands, as Canadians sitting at number 5, like how the heck does that happen?
Right.
We know how it happens and we need to follow that. But sorry to
No,
steal you.
No, it's exactly like, we do need to follow that. And you start thinking about how Canada looks at its food systems, and we think, well, Canada's cold, we can't produce it. Canada's climate isn't that different from the Netherlands. In fact, it has huge areas of climate that's much better in its climate than the Netherlands. So how do we learn from that? Because I think one of the things in terms of our sovereignty is we've given away our sovereignty in so many areas like food and agriculture, but natural resources especially because we have so much land. We don't have to process it. We don't have to do any value add. We don't have to add the IP. We have trees and rocks, like trees we cut down, rocks we pull out of the ground, and we send it all over the world to process. So how do we think of these as strategic assets that we can actually grow? So, and we can. And so the second part I just wanted to kind of set this piece up is defense. So if you think about what is defense. Defense is a country's ability to protect itself, to allow itself to be able to continue operating, for the country to be stable and to function as a nation, right? It's continued. And so we too often think about defense, like that's the purpose of defense. If someone attacks the country, we want to be able to protect its sovereignty, the country's sovereignty, and our ability to operate and function as a country. And so often we think about defense as a reactive process. If someone attacks us, whether that is economic attacks or physical attacks, how do we protect that country? But the thing is that I think COVID and other disruptions need to really make us realize is that defense is not about just hoping and trying to protect against that reaction one day. It's actually about being adaptable and flexible and resilient and to disruptions at any time. So not just protecting those borders for that potential reactive set of activities, but being thoughtful about how we actually adapt to that. And so that's where we need to think a little bit more holistically of how we think about defense, because defense means our ability to operate and our ability to function as a country. And if our food systems are cut, if we have a major hit to agriculture and food systems, that affects the stability of the country, and it affects the ability for our country, which is a major agricultural superpower, or should be even a bigger superpower, to be able to function and to feed itself. So I just want to pause it there.
That's great. Lots there. Great group of panelists. I guess on the being reactive, maybe we could talk about how can Canada be more proactive on this front? John, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. And Kathleen, this is where I think the real opportunity is. So I think people certainly in this session here completely understand sovereignty is about control over your destiny. Now, where I think that we're misfiring from a public policy perspective, that when we talk about food, right now, the discussion is around the cost of food. Because there is a cost of living crisis for a lot of Canadians. And sovereignty and cost may end up, not necessarily, but it may end up being at odds with one another. So for example, China and Japan still produce their own rice, on average 40% at a higher cost than what they would pay on the importation. But they did not want to risk another country having control over their direction or with a threat of starving their people. So when we look at Canadian public policy, now, number one, when we do this, this could mean that the costs to produce, at least in the short term, might be higher in Canada. And one of the things that Canada has done a poor job at, and you can replace food with the energy, is we're very good at extraction. We are terrible at increasing the value chain beyond that. And when you look at the wealth of nations, it really is about net terms of trade, which basically means when we trade with somebody, try to have as much value as possible, as opposed to, growing food and then having some other country process it and sell it back to you as a end byproduct, and you're paying 10 times more. Well, in that example, there's a net at 9x terms of trade. And so what Canada will have to do, if we want to look at the medium to long term at the pain of potentially increasing the costs, is retaining much more of the value chain. And in doing so, the advantage that we can do today is we also have a very strong technology industry. And what's going to be fascinating about food, and the reason why I got really excited about it, is the impact of technology, whether it's, satellites, AI, quantum, robotics, all of these things, which will decrease the cost of the food over the medium to the long term, so that our population doesn't suffer from a cost of living perspective. But the second element of that is, if we tie in the sovereignty and security over our food supply with economic development, even if our food costs go up, but Canadians make more money than they did before because the industry is making more money, then it doesn't really matter that there's more costs. The problem that Canada is facing is not necessarily our cost of living, it's our very low increase in our productivity, i.e. our living standard and our average income that we're generating. So combining these economic policies with food sovereignty, I think, is really the direction from a public policy perspective that we really need to head into.
I think that's a great point. Karin, you're the founder of 3 companies with a lot of tech expertise. Maybe you can comment on that a little bit.
Yeah. Thanks. And John, to that point, I just want to add to John's point on, yes, there's the value add piece that helps to grow our economy, but there's also, I want to go back to this Netherlands example because there's also a productivity gap. We have been doing things the same way for a long period of time with not many different changes, many changes in terms of our efficiency and productivity. And when you look at why the Netherlands have gone up in their productivity is because they're applying best practices, IP, engineering, like they're applying thought to how they actually grow and are able to get the most out of every acre. And that comes from that's thinking everything from soil and the soil health, because soil is the engine of agriculture, to robotics and AI and automation and systems. So if we can think in how we can actually build out systems to increase our productivity, it has a huge impact. And Darren will know this much more than I. But with agriculture, I think it's like for every 1% increase in agricultural productivity on Canadian farmlands, is it $30 billion? $30 billion additional GDP for every 1%. And this should be low-hanging fruit that we should be going after to start building our economy. So one of the key things that we look, so my background is as a biologist. I also have a background in government and law. And before I started, I've been focused on this. Terramera was founded 15 years ago, so I'm dating myself now, while I was in university at UBC, and really focused on how we can use technology to initially, this will make sense for me because I'm from BC, how to use technology to align profits with environmental impact as well. So, but also that comes from a basis as a biologist, you see biology is so smart. If you can actually work in tandem with biology, you can actually increase your what you get out of it. So for every acre of land, if we're not just trying to engineer and fight biology, but we are actually trying to build it up, we'll actually get much more productivity out of it. So a lot of what we do is, Terramera has built over almost 350 patents. It was a Canadian company. We out of that, we've actually built out a a unique system of IP. We saw that IP as a critical piece of our assets. And so we have a broad set of IP that we then create companies to focus on parts of the value chain. So soil is one of them. Miraterra is our company that focused on soil, and we focus on how to be able to really impact and grow soil, because now here's another few pieces of stats. If you can increase soil health by about 1%, that equates to roughly, depending on the crop, on average, 6% increase in profits, usually on broadacre crops. It also, that 1% increase also has a huge effect on resiliency. So every 1% increase in soil health has results in 200,000 liters of water holding capacity per hectare. So, I've mentioned this before, because, I've seen farms that have and land managers that have increased their soil health by 10%. 10% means 2 million liters more water holding capacity per hectare. That's 1,000 swimming pools of water. Now you think about all the things we're dealing with in terms of adaptation and system resilience. We hear about fires and floods and droughts. As we're thinking about adaptation, our system and foundation needs to be there. Canada has a potential to lead the world here. Canadian soils are not as bad as some soils. I mean, the U.S. has some areas where they've desertified whole areas. On average, Canadian soils are about 1% to 3% organic matter. But you can bring that way up. And as we do that, it has a huge impact on productivity and on national security and our resilience of our food systems.
I'm going to do a little bit of framing, because I think the original question, right, sort of dove into government and whatnot. And I'm going to tell a story, and I want everyone to understand I'm an employee of a crown corporation. So I'm telling the story that what somebody else said, not me.
Oh, okay. Nice try on that one.
Take your pills, John. We were meeting with the Minister of Ag and had brought in a couple global institutional investors representing about $250 billion of capital. And the minister was asking questions, starting with something as simple as, how do you view investing in Canadian food and ag as an opportunity? And what one of the global investors, non-Canadian, said, well, it's really two stories. Story number one is, we have not heard your government speak about food and ag as part of the nation building strategy. We've heard you talk about automotives, 2% of the GDP. We've heard you talk about energy, very reasonable, rational. But put stats aside, right? The observation of external capital looking at food and ag as an opportunity and not hearing our federal government include food and ag, 7% of the GDP, as an area of focus, resonated in a negative way globally, because many of those investors have an investable universe, which is broad. They could buy a German media company. They could invest in a Melbourne port. You know what we need in Canada is capital to continue to drive productivity. So that was one piece, sort of the negative. The positive that this investor, she said, when we sit back, she was from London, but when we sit back in the UK and think about the theses that are driving our food and ag investing, it is the fact that the human race needs 25% more calories by 2050. Her words, that is a shitload more calories. And guess what they're not making any more of? Farmland. Karna and I spent a coffee talking about reclamation of land, so park that as a side. And so why these investors are looking at Canada is because what do we have? We have primary production. We have farmland. I wanted to share that story because it's two very interesting pieces where these are smart external individuals looking at global macro trends and identifying Canadian food and ag as an opportunity, and yet not hearing it from Canadians. Just a quick that IP overlay and technology overlay in defense. Not creating any more land, productivity in food and ag has been dropping for the last 10 years. Bunch of reasons why. We don't have the time, and you can guess. Soil as an example. Post World War II focus on food and ag was what? Calories. That's not the focus of food and ag. Food and ag is a system. We should never be talking about how many more harvests soil has. Like, think about that for a sec. There is discussion about how many more harvests the soil can have. Soil is not one of those resources where you're like, oh, I've got this much more left in the bottle and then I get another one. No, soil needs to be a system. But if I come back to IP, our chief economist frames it this way. We have Canada, we have the land. We need technology to drive productivity. We need to be very thoughtful about that. And what he says is, imagine we have a bunch of houses. And to make those houses more efficient, we bring in technology for HVAC. That technology may well come from outside of Canada. You could see where this goes. One day we go to the thermostat and we are locked out of the thermostat. So when we think at Farm Credit Canada about technology, IP to drive productivity, when we are starting from the land that Canada already has, the sovereignty of the IP, the sovereignty of the technology, the sovereignty of the data that is being produced from our industry is the forefront of our mind, because the last thing we want is that farmer to go to their combine, which is basically a computer on wheels these days, and try and turn it on, and it doesn't turn on. Did that scare anyone? Sometimes. I tell that story to my kids at night, and they're like, Dad, that's like...
I'll bring it home to my 5- and 3-year-old, create some nightmares. I like it. I'm curious. I mean, we're amongst a lot of IP experts are in the room. So I guess, we're getting near the end of the panel, but comments around IP for this audience and this topic, and then we'll close with a final question, but maybe just open it around IP for further discussion.
Yeah. So I think, again, coming back to sovereignty, I think IP is really only valuable if it's activated and it's actually used. We have in Canada some of the greatest ideas. We can solve a lot of our solutions in productivity if we can actually start applying our own IP and our own technologies in the country. As a founder of a company, I would say you'll hear this. You probably all know this or have heard this from tech founders, which is Canada is oftentimes one of the last or latest places where you have adoption of our own technology. We almost always have to go somewhere else because we don't trust that good ideas can come here, and we invest so much money into ideas that are changing the world. AI, invented here, or modern AI. So how do we actually start harnessing and using these things as critical infrastructure? Darren was talking about soil. I don't know if everyone understood that term about how many years of soil. The UN estimates that we have something on the order of 50 to 60 harvests left before our entire system of agriculture collapses as we know it. Why? Because we're killing our soil. We've killed something like 40% of the global soils, 70% of topsoil on global farmlands. But soil's alive. Like we're 59% of all of life on the planet lives in soil. Senate did a great report. I see Senator Deacon here, Critical Ground, which I think should be required reading, on how important this is and how important soil is to national sovereignty. So how do we start thinking about, one, utilizing our own IP in our country? Two, there's a great panel on defense at the beginning talking about placing some bets. So placing some bets in Canada about our own technology and getting it out there so that it can actually transform agriculture and increase productivity on the acres, not as an idea, not not, saying, go prove yourself in the United States first before we fund you. Here in Canada, getting it onto the acres so people can start utilizing it and farmers can utilize it to build our GDP and our security. And 3, starting to actually think about things like soil as a national asset. Canada actually, as IP, it is IP. It is our property, soil property, natural property, intellectual property. And one way that it is not only defense, but intellectual property is Canada actually was a leader I believe it was in the 80s, Canada started trying to build a national soil map. And it was never finished. It was a victim of budget cuts, and it never got finished. Well, we have technology now that can actually build a national soil map at a fraction of the cost. At a fraction of the cost. And we can, Miraterra is an example. We actually can digitally scan soil for, in seconds, what used to cost a huge amount of money, sent to a lab using chemicals to know every single piece, every single component that's in there. We can now scan it and get it all of the components that it gets trained with, in seconds to minutes. So how do we start utilizing that and actually start building these things like national soil maps for our sovereignty, for security, for increasing our productivity and GDP, but also for defense? I just want to give you one more example around soil, and then I'll pass it on. We don't realize that, soil as IP, how knowing what's happening is important until you start looking at other examples of what happened in warfare. So in the Ukraine, when Russia invaded, one of the first things that Russia did is plant landmines on Ukrainian farmland. So of those of you who know about agriculture might know that prior to Ukraine being invaded, Ukraine was one of the largest agricultural producers and kind of the breadbasket of Europe. This is why Europe is thinking a lot more about food security now and has this resilience first framework in their national defense strategies. And if you don't know about resilience first, I encourage you to look at it, because it's about how to actually be able to anticipate, absorb, and adapt to disruptions, including security disruptions, not just to our borders, but to borders of countries that are important, like Ukraine. So Ukraine has gone from one of the largest producers to basically nothing. Its stability and its ability to feed itself, but also, it's some of its biggest customers, which was Europe and the UK. So what they did is actually put landmines on there because they knew that farmland couldn't be used. Then the Ukrainian army had to go in and blow up the mines, because for safety reasons. And then what happens when you blow up the mines? It spread chemicals all over the soil, and you can't grow any food there. So if we're able to actually understand that to protect against our own security, that's one of the key things that people realize is our soils, then we can actually, we need to start thinking about these things that we used to have, like a national digital soil map that actually is able to see and understand if there's any kind of anything from the resilience and the productivity of those soils going down, to if there was chemical warfare, which is chemical and biological warfare are some of the hardest things to predict. So that could happen without us technically even being invaded. And there's so how do you actually be able to know that information quickly? And we have the technology to be able to do that. So now the question is, we have a lot of money going to defense. Are we going to think about that only in terms of fighter jets, or are we going to think about that in terms of how we protect the nation's ability to actually operate? And those are things like soil maps.
John, Darren?
Yeah, just very specifically to your question on IP, the key point here in the post-World War II industrial economy, jobs produced wealth through economic spillovers. In the digital economy, in which we're in now, and we have been really in the last 3 decades, the ownership of wealth, which really means IP, is what creates jobs. It's the opposite way around. Our public policy makers don't understand that the world changed about 3 decades ago. The United States led that transformation. And if you can't see the game that they're playing, I challenge you to review multilateral trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and particularly around the agricultural areas, where they traded off foodstuffs for the right to extract the IP for usage. It was brilliance. Canada, asleep at the switch. We're still thinking of what the world was like 100 years ago. And it's time that when you're looking at intellectual property, there is the entire food industry that I am looking to invest in will hinge on the ownership of the intellectual property and hence the ultimate wealth. And the last thing I will say, in a digital economy world, the problem as an investor is it's not necessarily a winner take all, but it's a few winners take all. And it's really through that ownership of IP. So Canada has to wake up that this is where the rest of the world will move. And the United States and China, frankly, China's been spectacular at it, are really ahead of the game. And we're just so far behind. But it's not like it's game over just yet.
The world, think of that anecdote I told, right? The world is looking at Canadian food and ag, and they are thinking about it as a target. It's an opportunity, but it's a target. We need to be thinking about food and ag from a sovereignty and a defense perspective. And so my ask of all of you, like, I'm sure you didn't come here expecting a food and ag panel. In your day jobs, just give a little thought to food and ag. You may say at your Monday stand-up, we're doing X, and you know what, food and ag isn't relevant? That's cool. Occasionally, you will suddenly say, wait a second, maybe food and ag is relevant. How should we be taking this into account when we think about these topics? That's I guarantee you, we talked about it. In 10 or 15 years, like John talks about picking winners, or like Canada better be the winner in Canadian food and ag. Canada in Canadian food and ag, and it's up to us now.
Amazing. I think we have time for one audience question if anyone has something. Any questions? Oh, yeah. They're going to bring you a mic.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's like mind-opening. At the beginning, when I heard like we could be a super global power, I was like, we the North. But I'm trying to see how it could work with the policies that we have now, or even like the economical plan that was laid ahead, which is supposed to be generational, and we barely heard anything about farming in it. And second of all, when hearing about like IP protection and how it could be a secret asset and everything like that, shouldn't at the bare minimum any IP coming from agriculture be taken into consideration as national defense and not be exported or like being like really strategically patented within? Because I don't know if in North America will somebody allow us to be two super global powers in the same continent.
Maybe we'll start with John, because it looked like you wanted to dive in on the budget, and we can use that as closing comments.
Yeah, I mean, you're Kathleen, when you started this session, I wrote a Substack article on food sovereignty. It was in response to not a single word really mentioned food in there. Now, it's still the first budget, but I wanted to make sure that on our next budget, it is considered. So your point is very well taken. On your second point, I'm also the co-founder of what's called the Council of Canadian Innovators. And one of the areas that we have proposed, and it's being considered, is an IP asset collective. These are IP assets that are owned collectively in Canada through a special national sovereignty fund. And this is exactly with your issue on things that are meaningful to Canadians, having Canadians and Canadian ecosystem the ability to be protected by that IP so that someone from outside of Canada doesn't use it to extract economic rents unreasonably from Canada. So that is one of the ideas that we hope to get across the goal line, hopefully for the next budget.
Karin?
Thanks. I think that a lot of this comes down to capital. Capital shows where your priorities are, and you look at how important Canada is, agriculture is to Canada, and the Ministry of or the Department of Agriculture is so small with so little funding. You compare that to other countries, and agriculture is a big department. It is a well-funded department. So I'm not speaking for the government where you do that. The funding could come through defense or ISED or other areas, but we need to be investing in agriculture as a critical asset to the country. That means digital infrastructure as well. That means systems that actually understand, are able to assess and predict what's happening and be able to support increases in productivity. So I think that includes funding for national digital infrastructure for farms. It's the AI revolution is going to hit everything. So we have an AI that we've built, but we need to get AI and systems onto agriculture, and that needs to be funded. And also national systems that are not just producer oriented, but are like looking at our land as an asset and a security. So things like that national digital soil map.
I saw David look at his watch, so I'll be quick. Two thoughts. Great question, folks. Number one, the Netherlands. Something they realized in subsectors is they are not competing against each other. They are collaborating to build a market that can then drive calories to the world. We need to do that in Canada, thinking that the IP and the data is not sitting within industry players, it's sitting within the industry. Stop competing with each other and realize every excess calorie we produce will be sucked up by the world because they need it. And last thought is what we at Farm Credit Canada call the mushy middle. And John, you nailed this. Canada, historically, we have been extractives. We take the base product and we send it out for value add. We in the government need to start thinking about the mushy middle of shipping, packing, processing. That adds the value. So those calories that we're going to produce, that we then make more valuable, that the world wants and needs increasingly, that's the strategy.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. David, you're back up.
I was just going to say no, Darren, you made a good comment. You said, who would have guessed to have this type of panel? Apparently we did. So thank you very much, Colin, for all this. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Thanks. So now it's the closing with Senator Colin Deacon, independent senator appointed in 2018. Come join me on the stage. Nice to have you. We'll have to get you have a mic.
Super. Oh. Great session. That was awesome.
I don't know how
Thank you,
to.
Kathleen.
Yeah.
Karin, Darren, John. That was awesome.
It's really something else. I mean, you managed to join us in the afternoon, an absolutely splendid time. Just in terms of a part of what you've done in terms of in the Senate work, I think there's a lot of things that we have to be able to mention about how you've looked at your advocacy done at the Senate, and if you can give us a little bit more of an insight in terms of the the programs that you've looked into and where you're headed in terms of looking at our innovation?
Well, I'm a former entrepreneur. So when I got this job, I came in with the belief that we can't have an innovative economy without an innovative government. And we don't have one right now. We haven't had one. But there's green shoots of hope with our new government for sure. But when it comes to IP, we've been the world's greatest philanthropist as it relates to intellectual property. We really, we want to make sure the world prospers like we have prospered. And we've been very successful at it. And what we have to do is change strategies. But I just want to build off of the Netherlands example. Their export value per arable acre of land is 70 times what it is in Canada. 70 times per arable acre of land. That is intellectual property. That is all that value add that they do and we don't do is undermining our prosperity. It's undermining our ability to invest in anything, in everything. Mm-hmm. So that's what I focus on. That's it's a great honor to serve in an independent Senate. Nobody whips my vote. Nobody tells me what speech to give. Nobody, we study the issues we want to study, and we get to, it is a really great change that the last prime minister made, in my opinion, and it's an incredible honor and responsibility to serve in that role. But it also is very frustrating from time to time, because we did a study in our banking committee on, and John was a great witness. We, Ruffalo and a number of others, we just had a tremendous study focused on, well, the title of our study was Needed, an Innovation Strategy for the Data-Driven Era. I mean, we don't have one in Canada. We hear that we had an AI strategy. I don't know if the AI strategy was from, to take us from being a leader to a laggard, but that's what happened. That's the reality of what happened, because we didn't focus on investing, on taking that intellectual capacity and turning it into assets that we could make wealth from. And so it's the foundation of what you're doing. I will stop at a certain point, but I'll probably need a poke because I can get on a roll. But there's signs of hope. But thing was really frustrating is I thought, I want to speak to Simon Kennedy about this, who is the deputy minister, because I was seeing all this money going into battery plants, commercializing foreign intellectual property, when we had one of the world's leading researchers in the field that we were not funding the commercialization. We were giving away his IP. And so the third meeting, he was very busy with his battery plant agreement work. And third meeting, we discussed the report, and he said, "Why are you guys so focused on IP?" And that really terrified me, right? To be honest, because if we don't have a government that understands that the wealth of the world is built on intellectual property, that's troublesome for Canada. If we don't have a government that understands that how we regulate determines where people choose to build their businesses, that are innovative businesses that are doing something dramatically different, how we procure. I have a lot of hope in our defense procurement that there's going to be changes. I have a lot of hope in that minister. I think he's a great parliamentarian. But what that hope was diminished a bit when the first announcement was procurement over $100 million, because that's totally goes to primes, right? There's no Canadian innovator going to be participating at that level.
I was just going to ask a question on that, because one of the comments I heard earlier. No, I'm not going to stop you. Well, one of the questions that I heard in the crowd earlier today was exactly the point of view of the SMEs. You're talking about the $100 million for the primes. So what happens to the SMEs? How do they get into that process, in your opinion?
So I think that's coming, because what was really great is I heard that a week ago he met with 10 different venture capital investors in Canada.
Okay.
I don't think there's been a defense minister in the history of this country that has met with venture capital investors. So that, to me, said, okay, something is coming. There's a focus here. They're just getting the big stuff out of the way, carry on with that. That's the traditional area. Get a better process in place so it doesn't take 25 years to buy $1 million item or $100 million item. You can do it a lot faster. But I believe that's coming, and I think it's thanks to dual use or multi-use that will drive it. And what I love about dual use, and the fact that we are a NATO Diana, we have several NATO Diana test centers, is that that's a beachhead market for a new innovator. Like I was an entrepreneur before this job. Having that first beachhead market is crucial to commercializing your technology. And so if we can be building for defense where there isn't the same regulatory constraints, and you can actually get a PO and start to build your capacity, start testing your technology, and then eventually refine it for a civilian market where there would be much larger potential often. Well, what's funny is anything that's priced as a defense product is 3 times the cost of what it would be as a civilian product, but that's a separate issue. Same thing. But getting that beachhead market is so important. So it's, that's new procurement money coming into the Canadian SME world. That holds great potential, and I do at this point have a lot of hope.
And who do you see playing that role, of that leadership role from the defense sector, to say this has got to change, and having the ear of the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Agriculture, et cetera, to say this is an important.
Yeah, the political leadership is there for the first time. That's what I'm seeing. Whether or not the public service can adjust. I mean, when you've got public service like Innovation Canada, where the top public servant in that department doesn't understand how IP is at the foundation of wealth creation, that's a culture change that's going to take some time. I think it needs some shots to the head. But honestly, we don't have time to do things incrementally. We've got to make some changes, because we're in a crisis situation as a country. Our sovereignty is being eroded. Look at data. Our PIPEDA is not doing its job right now. The Privacy Act is almost as old as my kids who are getting close to their 40s. There is no privacy control as it relates to the data gathered by political parties. It's zero. The political parties can gather and use data as they see fit, be breached and not have to report it. We've got a very lackadaisical attitude towards the core of economic wealth in a data-driven economy, which is data. And Canadians are sitting at the wrong end of a data vacuum. I believe that is going to start to change. I'm certainly anxious to see our new Canadian Privacy Protection Act tabled. We've tried twice, and that was the Commons. It hasn't been prioritized by the House of Commons. This isn't a single political party problem. This is a public service problem and a political leadership problem on every party's.
So we heard. It was Gordon Pesic earlier today was talking. We were talking about a bit about the agencies as to which agency should have that. Turn green now.
Okay, good.
Thanks. So they're talking about who would have ownership of that, or which agency should have ownership of being that conduit to government. Would it be something under a Privy Council of Office, or would it be a separate agency that would be able to direct the IP leadership that would be required in the country?
Could easily be.
Has yours died?
Did mine just go too?
Yeah, I'll share.
I'll just speak loudly. I'm used to it. I yell at my colleagues all the time. No. What's that?
People online needs you to speak on the line.
Okay. Oh, right.
Thank you very much.
There we go. Is that working? There we go.
Yes.
Super.
Thank you.
So I said should be the department for this work. But what I'd love to see is a prioritization of this work that I said. I think the bulk of the work since this new government got in place at that department is focused on steel, aluminum, cars on traditional industries and the minister's time. And I don't think that we've had a chance yet to see what's possible when we put our shoulder to the wheel on IP and data-driven items. That's where it should be focused for sure. But I do believe firmly there needs to be a culture change. I mean, one of the things that we wrote a report in our office, David did a ton of work on it, on the innovation support programs.
Mm-hmm.
We found 134 different programs, but none of them had KPIs related to the outcomes. What was actually happening in these businesses. And actually one of them did, Innovative Solutions Canada. That's the one that got us started, which is what was putting innovators together with innovative public servants and matching them up to solve big, hairy problems in an innovative way and be a first customer for Canadian innovators. That program was cut in half arbitrarily because public servants didn't like it. They just liked buying from others, the established groups. And my view is you should have said tough crap. You don't want to use this budget, you lose it, we're going to give it to those public servants who are using it, versus cutting the program in half. And there were several Canadian companies went bankrupt as a result because they were right at the end of the process, about to have a signed contract. That for me was incredibly upsetting that, that the department chose to do something that was harmful to Canadian innovators, but that was a choice. So we thought, let's study the other programs. Must be amazing because this ISC program was producing $3 in GDP growth for every dollar invested and $1.30 in taxes after 5 years. So this was an incredible program delivering. I didn't audit the results, but I took involved in Statistics Canada. I thought they must have some credibility, but that was a program that was cut. There's 134 programs. I'd love it if there's four that were really targeted on key strategic elements that are needed to bridge the gap that has been talked about here between our incredible ability to create IP and how do we create a bridge that we stop giving it away and we start making sure that it is creating opportunities, jobs, and wealth in Canada. And I'm sure there are, you've had a lot of the bright people here today that can design what those programs look like. And why are we not working with them? Why are we designing them in Ottawa? Why are we not working with those who are living the problem and seeing how they can help it? So for me, I think could be a tremendous help, but it really fundamentally needs to change as a department.
Well, it is a challenge, and one of the things that we were looking at as well, and that's why the simple agreement for innovation licensing, the SAIL agreement that you were aware of or familiar with. Now, we thought that was a good mechanism.
It's a simple tool that's solving a real problem, and it's a barrier. Simplified agreements in Nova Scotia. There was a change that occurred about 20 years ago, where all of a sudden our lawyers started to produce a really simple onboarding for new founders that gave them their IP agreements, gave them the shareholder agreement, their employment agreement, a whole bunch of basic agreements that were done in a standardized form that aligned up with what investors were looking for. And it was such a breath of fresh air because it was a lot cheaper. And those agreements were starting to be modified in a way that was consistent, and you were building your company in a way that the next investor was going to be not wanting to have to rewrite all of these foundational agreements. SAIL agreement's part of that process, a little earlier in it. It's a critical element of it, and I'm a big supporter.
Great, thank you. I'm just thinking at the time because now I know it's getting close to the end of day, and I really appreciate the whole audience being here all day to be able to get as much absorption of IP, culture, information, and I'm very appreciative of that. But in terms of, from your perspective, in terms of a closing, what would you do differently? Is there something that you would want to bring to the table in terms of a concluding remark to this FORPIQ 2025?
We've got to start talking about the problem in ways that people understand and that our MPs start to understand. And I had the pleasure 35 years ago working with the Medical Research Council of Canada, which became CIHR, and I ran their first strategic planning process at, fairly early on in my career. Not as early on as I would have liked. I'm a little older than I want to be right now, but the process was really informative to me. because it showed at that time we had a significant problem of matching our ability to solve problems with the problems we need to solve in our economy, and with those who are capable of understanding the science and the potential and building a commercialization path and fund that commercialization path. And we had a really limited capacity in that regard. We've now got a number of different organizations in this country that are globally leading in their ability to understand the domain expertise, the scalability challenges, the investment opportunities, and bring a world-class capacity to commercializing knowledge. But what we still haven't done, though, is take that and apply it more strategically within our economic plumbing, our regulations. A week ago, yesterday, I was meeting with 4 different regulators in a committee meeting in a new industry in Canada. All 4 want to have a piece of the regulatory challenge. They're all talking about the risks that this introduces to the Canadian economy. None of them are talking about the opportunities, not one. They're talking, okay, small scale is okay.
Oh dear.
They all we're focused on the way to stop the process. You know, we want to test everything and before we let this become large scale, but they couldn't define small scale and they couldn't define large scale. They didn't have evidence for their definitions of those. And so our regulators are not being forced to balance risks and opportunities. We'll never commercialize things in Canada unless our regulators get comfortable with that need to balance risk and opportunity as we have our regulations start to keep up with the discoveries that we have and the new market opportunities and new solutions that we can bring forward. So number one, we've got to get that plumbing right. Our ability to be much more agile and less burdensome in our regulations. That doesn't mean there's more risk to Canadians or more, there's less safety. It just means we're being smarter about it. Procurement is just crucial. We've got to be the first, as CCI, John mentioned CCI earlier, that we've got to be the first and best customer of our innovators in this country and give them a chance. You know, I built 2 businesses, never selling a thing in Canada because it was just too hard. I mean, and one of them got acquired by an American group, a great exit for me, but that IP still needed in Canada and could be adding value in Canada and solving Canadian problems is gone. We've got to stop that. We've got to be our own best customer. So it's that economic plumbing, but we've got to talk to our MPs. We've got to get them to understand it at a fundamental level and see the gaps, because it's like we're on it. I don't know if you've ever traveled along. I remember traveling on the road. We're just running out here. Travel on those roads in the south of France, just as you leave Italy, and it's bridge, tunnel, bridge, tunnel, bridge, tunnel.
Cliff.
That's right. But it's, that's what we've got in commercializing IP in Canada. But we don't have the bridges and the tunnels yet. We just have that coastline. And we're still successfully commercializing a lot of things, but we've got to build the bridges and tunnels, and I'm mixing my metaphors like crazy, but now that's the economic plumbing that we need, that we've got to get sorted out. And we just haven't. We haven't had to. It's like agriculture. We could make a ton of money at $1 per acre, not the $70 per acre that the Netherlands gets, 70 times. We could do well at that, but no longer. It's not going to be there anymore. So we have to get smart, and we have to do the tough work. But the neat thing about making these changes, and I will stop. But the great thing about making these changes is they don't really cost money. It's just work. It's getting regulators to get out. This group of regulators, I said, have ever of you met with a proponent of the technology? Have you gone to see them? Oh, our enforcement officers have. Like just not getting the issue at all. And so that's the part that if we can start to get that right, I believe that's the intention of this government.
That's music to my ears. Honestly, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Denis, peux-tu me donner le clicker? Peux-tu me passer le clicker, s'il te plaît?
Oh, done?
We are almost done.
Oh,
I have to do the closing arguments. I figured you'd stay with me up on stage.
I'm very happy to.
Thank you very much.
Do I get to rebut?
Sure. I was going to put a standing order of sorts, but maybe. Thank you. So basically, I just wanted to thank everybody here for having attended this long day. You've endured as much me today, which I appreciate. Thank you very much. Just in terms of a closing argument, what I thought was pivotal in getting FORPIQ out this year, the way that we did the format, was I wanted to give you as much oversight as to how to get your IP house in order. IP is everywhere. The intellectual property, how we're looking at the asset itself as a business asset. We heard it from the defense folks this morning. We're looking at how much investment that's being put in. We've heard from the agricultural side, the impact, the automatic impact you can get from being able to not only protect, but also use that intellectual property directly on farmland to be able to get more outputs. Senator Deacon spoke to the outputs as well. He also spoke to the question of the risks, which I thought was very important. Because one of the things that you're looking at in terms of risks, it's getting that SWOT analysis done correctly to be able to see what we're good at, the strengths, what are our weaknesses, opportunities, the threats we know where they're coming from. We spoke about them at length this morning as well. So this is something that I thought was important to discuss, but also there's the financial aspect as well. And I'm just going to put up one slide for you, is that. So not a lot of people get to see it, but it's a bit of a spaghetti of sorts, where we're looking, that is your whole IP journey from day one, from the very early on stages in the research labs, as it progresses through times, and we're looking at a series of flywheels that are being created over time. The flywheels are the financial incentives, the financial vehicles, the fiscal advantages that can be given to you, to businesses. They could come from federal and provincial funding programs. It comes from the CEL framework as well. To those, we can add the SR&ED tax credits. Those have a significant impact. You're also looking at the industrial technology benefits policy that has impact as well for the primes and as well for the SMEs that are able to graft onto those types of policies. We have the various tax credit and incentive programs. We already said SR&ED. There's also in Quebec the CRIC. There's also the DC program, which is the patent box for the Quebec version of that. We have the export programs that the Trade Commissioner Service was here as well. CAN export program. There's also there are other support programs that allow us to take our Canadian intellectual property abroad internationally. That's leading to the value in the supply chains to be able to protect those as well. There was also mention from the defense side, there was a Defense Security Resilience Bank, Kevin Murray, that I've met on different occasions as well, also based in Canada, trying to get the headquarters in Ottawa as well. Just when I was in the US, last October 13th, I was walking around New York City, and lo and behold, you have JP Morgan Chase, $1.5 trillion US being invested into defense from an American perspective. If there's access to that from the Canadian side as well, it's a game changer in my opinion. So by taking all these, by mastering all of that, I think we have a really good chance to make a significant change in our economic policy, our national economic technological sovereignty. These are things that we're able to capture here in Canada and be able to show, not only what's the expression, punch above our weight class, but to be able to be I would say a proper G7 country. We are, and I hate to say this again and again, but we are the 10th largest global economy. That's something that we have to be able to think of more and more. So again, I would like to say thank you to all. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Deloitte for hosting us. Thank you to the organizing committee, Joanne, for the opening comments, my treasurer, Alejandro, that's around here somewhere, and everybody that has had an involvement in this, as well as our financial partners at Axidis Desjardins, Gowling and as well as Lavery that supported FORPIQ for the last 2 years. And I look forward to having everyone at the next roundtable. Thank you very much.